Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to ancient Egypt, where the golden glow of bread ovens illuminates mud brick homes along the Nile. You can almost smell the rich, earthy aroma of freshly baked loaves cooling on reed mats, their crusts cracking slightly as they settle. The warm scent of fermenting dough mingles with the river's humid breath as dawn breaks over the pyramids. Of course, if you actually tried living on the average Egyptian's daily bread ration, you'd probably crack a tooth on stray bits of sandstone that inevitably made their way into the flour when it was ground on stone querns. Not exactly the dream vacation you've imagined. If this is helping your restless mind slow down, gently tap that like button and subscribe to our historical sleep journeys. I invite you to share your location and local time in the comments, so we can know where our community of dreamers is joining us from. Now, prepare your environment. Reduce the brightness of your room. Rest your eyes momentarily while taking 3 deep breaths. And let's gently navigate together through this narrative that will lead us to rest. Bread wasn't just food in ancient Egypt. It was life itself. When you walk through a typical Egyptian village around 2500 BCE, bread is literally everywhere. From dawn until dusk, the rhythmic sound of grinding grain forms the heartbeat of daily existence. Women kneel over limestone querns, pushing and pulling heavy grinding stones across the surface, gradually transforming hard emmer wheat berries into coarse flour. The work is backbreaking, and if you look closely at skeletal remains from this period, you'll notice many women have worn down knee joints and damaged lower backs, occupational hazards of the ancient world's most essential labor. What makes Egyptian bread so fascinating isn't just its omnipresence, but its surprising diversity. Contrary to what many assume, Egyptian bread wasn't a monotonous one-note staple. Archaeological evidence from sites like Deir el-Medina, the village that housed workers who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, reveals over 30 distinct bread shapes and varieties. Some loaves were round and flat, others tall and conical, and still others shaped like animals or human figures for ritual purposes. The foundation of every Egyptian loaf was, of course, grain. As you watch farmers harvesting in the fields, you'd notice they're gathering something that doesn't quite look like the wheat you're familiar with. That's because ancient Egyptians primarily used emmer wheat, Triticum dicoccum, a hearty ancestor of modern wheat that was particularly well suited to Egypt's climate. Emmer has a stubborn husk that clings to the grain even after threshing, making it significantly more labor-intensive to process than modern wheat variety. You might also spot farmers collecting barley, which was used more commonly in beer production, but sometimes mixed into bread, especially for poorer households. Historians still argue about exactly when Egyptians began cultivating emmer wheat, but the consensus points to sometime around 4000 BCE. What's not in dispute is that this cultivation changed everything. The ability to grow surplus grain transformed Egyptian society from isolated groups of hunter-gatherers into one of history's most impressive civilizations. Bread, quite literally, built the pyramids. As you wander through a typical Egyptian village, you'd notice that social status is immediately apparent in bread consumption. A wealthy official's household might consume several different varieties daily, while a poor laborer might subsist on a single type of rough, coarse loaf that's as much chaff as it is flour. The average Egyptian worker received about 10 loaves as daily payment, a currency you could quite literally take to the baker. The most surprising aspect of Egyptian bread that modern people miss, it's not the taste or texture, though those would certainly be shockingly different from your supermarket sourdough. It's the sound. Egyptian villages hummed with the constant percussion of bread preparation. The grinding of stones, the slapping of dough, the crackling of oven fires. Bread wasn't just eaten. It was heard, smelled, and experienced as the sensory center of daily life. While we often think of wheat as a single crop, the emmer variety that ancient Egyptians cultivated for millennia would be almost unrecognizable to you compared to modern wheat. As you hold a handful of emmer grains, you notice immediately they're smaller, darker, and encased in a stubborn husk that refuses to separate from the grain without significant effort. This isn't the golden waves of wheat you might picture. Emmer is a more resilient, primitive cousin, with genetic roots stretching back to the very dawn of agriculture. The story of emmer's dominance in Egypt is one of remarkable agricultural conservatism. While other civilizations experimented with different grains and eventually moved on to more easily processed varieties, Egyptians maintained their relationship with emmer for over 3,000 years, from pre-dynastic times until well into the Greco-Roman period. This wasn't due to ignorance or isolation. Egypt had extensive trade networks that could have introduced new crop varieties. Rather, emmer proved uniquely suited to Egypt's particular environmental conditions. As you watch farmers working in the fields beside the Nile, you'd notice how emmer's deep root system allows it to thrive in Egypt's unique agricultural cycle of flooding and drought. Unlike other ancient grains, emmer could withstand the annual inundation without rotting, and then survive the scorching dry season that followed. It also proved remarkably resistant to the fungal diseases that plagued other wheat varieties in humid river valleys. One ancient Egyptian agricultural text, which a scribe might read to you if you were important enough, describes emmer as the grain that lives twice, referring to its ability to recover after being submerged during the Nile's annual flood. Historians still argue about whether emmer's continued use was primarily practical, or if religious conservatism played a role. Some scholarly texts suggest Egyptians believed emmer was created from the tears of Osiris, god of the afterlife, which would certainly explain their reluctance to abandon it for more practical varieties. Whatever the reason, this stubborn adherence to tradition meant that Egyptian bread maintained a consistent character for thousands of years, a culinary continuity almost unmatched in human history. If you were to help with the harvest, you'd discover that emmer's tenacious husk required a special processing method called parching. After the wheat was cut, it would be spread out in the blazing Egyptian sun and lightly roasted to make the husks brittle enough to crack during threshing. You can almost feel the heat radiating off the threshing floor as workers beat the grain with wooden flails or led oxen around in circles to trample it. Yet even after this grueling process, the husks wouldn't completely separate, necessitating further processing before grinding could even begin. A quirky fact that archaeologists have uncovered is that emmer wheat actually contains significantly higher protein levels than modern varieties. This meant Egyptian bread, despite its reputation for being coarse, actually provided more nutritional value per loaf than you might expect. It's one of those historical ironies. Their primitive grain was in some ways nutritionally superior to our advanced varieties. If you could stomach the gritty texture and slightly bitter taste, you'd be getting a surprisingly complete protein package from your daily bread. The dominance of emmer created a distinct bread culture that differed significantly from other ancient civilizations. Unlike Mesopotamian breads, which incorporated a wider variety of grains, Egyptian breads maintained a more consistent character across centuries. As you bite into a piece of Egyptian emmer bread, you'd notice a distinctly nutty, slightly sweet flavor profile there's an earthiness to it that speaks to its ancient genetic origin. Archaeological evidence from tomb paintings and actual preserved loaves shows that Egyptians developed specialized techniques for working with emmer's particular properties. You'd see bakers adding extra water to emmer dough to compensate for the bran fragments that remained mixed with the flour, creating a stickier mixture that require different handling techniques. Some bakeries developed specialized wooden paddles designed specifically for manipulating wet emmer dough without it sticking to everything. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Emma's reign in Egypt is that it created an entirely different concept of what bread should be. If you're used to thinking of bread as soft, light, and airy, Egyptian emmer bread would challenge your most basic assumptions. Their ideal loaf was denser, heartier, and had what we might consider an almost cake-like quality, particularly in the finer varieties. When modern researchers have recreated ancient Egyptian bread recipes using authentic emmer, even experienced bakers are surprised by how different the dough behaves during mixing and proofing. By the late period, around 600 BCE, you would finally begin to see emmer's monopoly gradually weakening as durum wheat, a free-threshing variety that separates more easily from its husk, slowly entered Egyptian agriculture through Greek and Persian influences. But for the vast majority of ancient Egyptian history, when someone mentioned wheat, they were talking about emmer, the resilient grain that fed pharaohs and peasants alike for 3 millennia, and quite possibly the longest-running star ingredient in any major cuisine's history. Section 3. The heart of any baker's craft lies in their oven, and ancient Egyptian bread-making technology reveals an ingenuity often overlooked by historians fixated on pyramids and temples. As you approach an Egyptian bakery, the first thing that strikes you isn't the appearance of the ovens themselves, but the wave of intense heat radiating from them. These aren't the neatly insulated cooking appliances of the modern world. These are fire-breathing dragons of clay and mud brick that dominate the workspace and transform it into something approaching a sauna. The most common bread oven you'd encounter is the beja, a conical clay structure that resembles an oversized beehive cut in half. Standing about waist high, with walls roughly 4 inches thick, these ovens feature a small opening at the bottom where fuel is fed, and another at the top where smoke escapes. What makes them particularly clever is their construction material, Nile mud mixed with straw, which forms a natural insulation that retains heat remarkably well. If you placed your hand near one, though please don't touch, you'd feel how the oven continues radiating consistent heat long after the initial fire has died down to embers. The beja's design hasn't changed significantly in 5,000 years. In fact, if you travel to rural Egypt today, you might spot nearly identical ovens still in use. It's one of those rare instances where ancient technology proved so perfectly adapted to its environment and purpose that millennia of progress couldn't improve upon it. The design's brilliance lies in its simplicity. The curved interior creates a natural convection current that distributes heat evenly and allows bread to cook uniformly without turning. Archaeological excavations at the workers' village of Deir el-Medina have revealed something unexpected about these ovens. They were typically situated in residential courtyards rather than inside homes. This placement wasn't just about fire safety, though that was certainly a consideration in settlements built primarily of mud brick. Historians still argue whether this outdoor placement was mainly practical, keeping the oppressive heat outside during Egypt's scorching summers, or if it had social significance, making bread production a more communal activity where neighbors could share both equipment and gossip. A particularly quirky fact that few people realize is that Egyptian bakers actually developed specialized oven tools that could be considered direct ancestors of our modern pizza peels. Wooden paddles with long handles allowed bakers to slap dough directly onto the scorching interior walls of the oven, where it would stick and bake vertically, an ingenious space-saving technique that maximized the oven's capacity. Imagine the skill required to prevent your day's wages from sliding down into the coals below. Not all Egyptian ovens were created equal, of course. If you were visiting a royal bakery or one serving an elite household, you might encounter more elaborate setups. The bakeries excavated near the Giza Pyramid complex feature multiple chambers and specialized areas for different types of bread. Some archaeological evidence suggests these elite bakeries even had temperature-controlled spaces where dough could rise at ideal rates regardless of the season, a technology we tend to associate with much later periods. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian oven technology was its fuel management. Wood was scarce and precious in ancient Egypt, so bakers developed alternative fuel sources that might raise your eyebrows. Dried cattle dung, mixed with straw and agricultural waste, became the primary fuel for bread ovens. Before you wrinkle your nose, consider that this material burns slowly and at a consistent temperature, perfect properties for bread baking. Once completely combusted, it leaves minimal residue or off flavors in the finished product. It's a reminder that necessity often breeds ingenious solutions in unexpected places. If you were to watch the actual baking process, you'd be struck by how different it is from modern methods. Rather than preheating an empty oven and then introducing the bread, Egyptian bakers often built the fire directly inside the oven cavity. When the walls reached the desired temperature, judged by experienced touch rather than thermometers, they would rake out most of the embers and quickly slap the dough inside before too much heat escaped. This technique created an environment closer to a modern wood-fired pizza oven than a conventional bread oven, with intense radiant heat coming from all surfaces. Perhaps the most impressive oven technology developed in ancient Egypt was the tanur, a cylindrical clay oven that appears in the archaeological record during the New Kingdom period. Unlike the bedja, which baked bread primarily through radiant heat, the tanur used a combination of convection and conduction that produced lighter, airier loaves. These specialized ovens were generally found only in urban centers or wealthy households, creating a clear demarcation between common bread and fine bread that reflected existing social hierarchies. Experimental archaeologists who have reconstructed these ancient ovens have discovered something surprising about their efficiency. Despite their primitive appearance, Egyptian bread ovens achieved remarkably precise temperature ranges between 450–500 degrees for most standard loaves, and maintained these temperatures with minimal fuel consumption. Modern tests suggest that once brought to temperature, a well-constructed bedja oven could bake successive batches for hours, using only small amounts of additional fuel. It's yet another example of how we sometimes underestimate the technological sophistication of ancient civilizations, especially when it comes to the everyday technologies that sustained daily life, rather than the monumental architecture that was designed to impress. The dichotomy between royal and common bread in ancient Egypt wasn't merely a matter of taste preference, it was a deliberate, visible manifestation of social hierarchy baked into every crumb. As you walk from a commoner's mud brick home to the alabaster-floored palace, the transformation of bread is nothing short of remarkable. What begins as simple sustenance in one setting becomes edible art in another, each loaf silently proclaiming its eater's place in the rigid social order. If you were fortunate enough to peek into a royal bakery during the Old Kingdom period, around 2500 BCE, you'd immediately notice the striking difference in ingredients. While common households made do with whatever grain they could afford, often emmer wheat mixed with barley, or even cheaper fillers like chickpeas and lentils, royal bakers worked exclusively with the purest, whitest emmer flour. This flour underwent repeated sifting through fine linen cloths, sometimes as many as 7 times, to remove every speck of bran and germ. The resulting powder was so refined that it bears more resemblance to modern cake flour than anything you'd recognize as whole wheat. A particularly fascinating discovery from the tomb of Tutankhamun reveals that royal bread often incorporated materials that no ordinary Egyptian would ever dream of adding to their dough. Analysis of residue from bread found in his tomb detected traces of tiger nut flour, dates, honey, and even milk, luxury ingredients that transformed bread from mere sustenance into a delicacy. Meanwhile, just outside the palace walls, the average worker was consuming bread made with coarsely ground flour still containing fragments of stone from the grinding process, bits of chaff, and occasionally even sand that had blown into the dough during preparation. The shapes of bread loaves also spoke volumes about their intended consumers. Common bread was typically round and flat, practical shapes that maximized oven space and ensured thorough baking. Royal bread, however, played by different rules entirely. Archaeological evidence and tomb paintings reveal an astonishing variety of shapes in elite contexts: spirals, crescents, human figures, animals, and even intricate geometric designs that served no practical purpose, but demonstrated the baker's skill and reinforced the pharaoh's status as someone who could command such labor-intensive frivolity. Historians still argue about the exact composition of the leavening agents used in different social contexts. While all Egyptian bread was naturally leavened, predating commercial yeast by millennia, evidence suggests that royal bakers maintained carefully cultivated starter cultures, perhaps the world's first sourdough, producing a more consistent, lighter texture. Common households, by contrast, relied on spontaneous fermentation or backslopping techniques, using a bit of the previous day's dough to kickstart fermentation in the new batch. The results were far less predictable, sometimes producing dense, barely risen loaves that could challenge even the healthiest teeth. A quirky tidbit that archaeologists have uncovered is that royal bread sometimes contained blue lotus powder, a mild psychoactive substance that induced a sense of euphoric well-being. This wasn't just about flavor enhancement, it was pharmaceutical bread, designed to ensure the royal family experienced a pleasant, slightly altered state during important meals. Commoners, needless to say, had to face reality without such botanical assistance in their daily bread. The difference in preparation methods was equally stark. If you observed a royal baker at work, you'd notice they kneaded the dough far longer than their counterparts in common bakeries, sometimes for hours. This extended kneading developed the gluten structure in ways that produced significantly lighter, airier loaves. Royal bakers also had the luxury of time, allowing dough to rise multiple times before, further improving the texture. Common bakers, typically women already burdened with numerous household tasks, simply couldn't afford to dedicate such time to the process. Their bread was often under-kneaded and minimally proofed, resulting in the dense, heavy loaves depicted in paintings of ordinary households. Perhaps the most visible distinction came in the form of bread accessories. Royal bread was frequently brushed with oils infused with imported spices like cinnamon and cardamom, astronomically expensive ingredients transported along trade routes spanning thousands of miles. Some elite loaves discovered in tomb offerings were even gilded with thin sheets of actual gold leaf, creating bread that literally glittered. Meanwhile, if the average Egyptian wanted to add flavor to their daily bread, they might incorporate locally available herbs like coriander or fenugreek, humble flavors for humble tables. Even the baking process itself reflected the social divide. Royal ovens were meticulously maintained at optimal temperatures by dedicated staff, whose sole responsibility was fire management. Common ovens, often shared between multiple households, fluctuated wildly in temperature depending on available fuel and the skill of whoever happened to be tending them that day. The result was predictably inconsistent. While royal bread emerged uniformly baked with perfect crusts, common loaves might be charred on one side and underdone on another. What's particularly interesting is that despite these enormous differences in quality and ingredients, the basic cultural significance of bread transcended social boundaries. Both pharaoh and field worker conceptualized bread as the fundamental embodiment of life itself. The hieroglyph for bread often stood in for the concept of food generally, and offering formulas in tombs of all social classes promised the deceased bread, beer, oxen, and fowl, with bread always listed first. It's a powerful reminder that while social hierarchies may divide how we eat, the fundamental human need for sustenance ultimately unites even the most stratified societies. The spiritual dimension of Egyptian bread transforms what might seem like a mundane foodstuff into something approaching the divine. As you step into a temple during the morning offering ritual, the air heavy with incense and the rhythmic chanting of priests, you notice something surprising taking center stage on the altar. Not gold or jewels, but bread loaves arranged in precise, meaningful patterns. These aren't just food, they're tangible prayers, physical manifestations of Egypt's complex relationship with its gods. Bread's religious significance begins with creation itself. In several Egyptian creation myths, the god Khnum formed humans on his potter's wheel using Nile mud, the same primary ingredient used in bread ovens. This parallel wasn't coincidental. It established a symbolic connection between the creation of humanity and the creation of bread. When a baker shaped dough with their hands, they were, in a small way, reenacting divine creation. You can almost feel the weight of this metaphysical responsibility as you watch bakers working their dough with reverent concentration. The most sacred bread in ancient Egypt was undoubtedly the Sheen's loaf, a tall conical bread created specifically for temple offerings. Archaeological evidence from temple bakeries suggests these loaves underwent ritual purification before baking. The water used in the dough was drawn from sacred wells, the grain was ceremonially blessed, and even the bakers themselves performed ablutions before handling the ingredient. Historians still argue about whether these purification rituals were primarily religious in nature, or if they also served as early food safety measures, keeping temple bread free from contamination. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of sacred bread was its role in the cult of Osiris. Small loaves shaped like mummies, complete with detailed facial features, have been discovered in tombs dating back to the Middle Kingdom. These Osiris breads symbolized resurrection and rebirth, their fermentation and rising process serving as a perfect metaphor for the god's legendary return from death. When placed in tombs, these breads were thought to magically transform into actual sustenance for the deceased in the afterlife. It's a poignant reminder that bread symbolized life even beyond death. A quirky detail that archaeobotanists have uncovered is that certain ritual breads incorporated henbane seeds, a mildly hallucinogenic ingredient that likely induced altered states of consciousness in priests who consumed them during specific ceremonies. These vision breads weren't everyday fare, but were reserved for particular festivals where communion with the divine realm was especially important. The boundary between bread as food and bread as sacramental substance was remarkably fluid in ancient Egyptian religious practice. The opening of the mouth ceremony, perhaps Egypt's most important funerary ritual, featured bread in a surprising role. Special loaves were touched to the lips of mummies to symbolically restore their ability to eat, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. The composition of these particular loaves remains somewhat mysterious, though chemical analysis of residue suggests they contained unusually high concentrations of honey and aromatic resins. Their appearance in tomb paintings shows them colored white with red speckles, possibly representing the stars against the milky backdrop of the celestial Nile. If you were to witness the daily temple rituals, you'd be struck by the sheer quantity of bread involved. The great temple of Amun at Karnak reportedly required over 3,000 loaves daily for its offering tables. These weren't consumed by the gods in any literal sense, of course. After being presented before the deity's statue, most offering bread was redistributed to priests and temple workers in a system known as the reversion of offerings. This created a practical economic circularity to what might otherwise seem like wasteful religious practice. The gods consumed the spiritual essence of the bread, while humans benefited from its physical substance. One particularly intriguing form of sacred bread was the pesan, a flat, circular loaf that appears frequently in offering scenes. What makes pesan loaves noteworthy is that they were often impressed with seals bearing the cartouche, royal name, of the reigning pharaoh. This transformed ordinary bread into a political statement, a physical manifestation of the pharaoh's divine right to rule and his role as intermediary between humans and gods. Imagine the psychological impact of literally consuming your ruler's name as part of a religious observance. The connection between bread and immortality appears repeatedly in Egyptian religious texts. The Book of the Dead contains spells specifically designed to ensure the deceased would have access to bread in the afterlife. And one of the most common tomb inscriptions, the Hetep Dinesat formula, specifically requests 1,000 of bread and beer for the deceased. Archaeological evidence confirms these weren't mere metaphors. Many tombs contained actual bakeries in their forecourts, designed to produce fresh bread offerings for spirits of the dead in perpetuity. Beyond formal religion, bread featured prominently in household magical practices as well. Small loaves shaped like specific body parts have been discovered in domestic contexts, suggesting they functioned as sympathetic magic. Bread shaped like an ear might be used in healing rituals for earaches, while bread formed like a heart could feature in love spells. Women in labor often clutched small bread amulets shaped like ankhs, the hieroglyphic symbol for life, to ensure safe delivery. These practices reveal how thoroughly bread had infiltrated every aspect of Egyptian spiritual life, from grand temples to humble household shrines. Despite its crucial role in formal worship, perhaps bread's most profound spiritual significance in ancient Egypt was its embodiment of Ma'at, the concept of cosmic order, balance and justice that formed the foundation of Egyptian theology and ethics. The reliable transformation of chaotic individual ingredients, water, flour, salt, into the ordered, nourishing harmony of bread perfectly mirrored the gods' transformation of primordial chaos into the ordered universe. Each properly baked loaf served as a small, everyday miracle, tangible proof that chaos could be converted to order through proper knowledge and action. In this light, every Egyptian baker performed a kind of practical theology with each batch of dough. The notion that ancient Egyptian bread was a bland utilitarian foodstuff couldn't be further from the truth. As you peek into bread baskets throughout the Nile Valley, you discover an astonishing array of flavored innovations that would challenge any modern artisanal bakery. Egyptian bakers were, in many ways, the original flavor scientists, transforming simple loaves into complex gustatory experiences through clever additions and techniques developed over thousands of years of culinary experimentation. Coriander seeds emerge as perhaps the most ubiquitous flavoring agent in Egyptian bread. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tel El Daba have uncovered bread remains containing crushed coriander that dates back to at least 1500 BCE. This pungent, citrusy spice wasn't just added for flavor, Egyptians believed coriander possessed magical properties that could prevent food poisoning, a belief that modern science partially vindicates, as coriander does contain compounds with mild antimicrobial properties. As you bite into a coriander-infused loaf, the bright, almost lemony flavor provides a perfect counterpoint to the nutty density of emmer wheat. Onions and garlic, those staples of Egyptian cuisine that famously caused the Hebrew slaves to wax nostalgic in biblical accounts, frequently found their way into bread dough as well. Bakers would roast them before incorporation, caramelizing their natural sugars and intensifying their flavors while softening their sharpness. The result was a savory loaf with complex, somewhat sweet undertones that paired perfectly with the simple bean stews that formed the protein backbone of most Egyptians' diets. These allium-enhanced breads were particularly popular among laborers who appreciated their robust flavors after hours of physical work. A particularly quirky discovery from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina reveals that some specialty breads contained ground locusts as a flavoring agent. Before you recoil in horror, consider that these insects were prized for their nutty, slightly umami flavor profile, not unlike the cricket flour some adventurous modern bakers have begun to experiment with. Locusts were dried, ground into a fine powder, and incorporated into festival loaves, adding both flavor and a valuable protein boost. Historians still argue about whether this practice developed as a way to make use of the periodic locust swarms that plagued Egyptian agriculture, or if locusts were deliberately cultivated for this purpose. Fenugreek emerges in the archaeological record as another favorite bread flavoring, particularly in Upper Egypt. Its distinctive maple-like sweetness and slight bitterness made it especially popular in celebration loaves. Egyptian bakers discovered that soaking fenugreek seeds overnight before incorporation into dough not only softened them, but also initiated enzymatic changes that enhanced their natural sweetness. Some scholars believe this discovery may represent one of humanity's earliest examples of deliberate food biochemistry. Dried fruits transformed everyday bread into something approaching modern cake in wealthier households. Dates, figs, and raisins were chopped fine and kneaded directly into the dough, creating sweet pockets throughout the finished loaf. A fascinating technique documented in tomb paintings shows bakers layering the dough with fruit pastes, then folding it repeatedly, a method strikingly similar to modern laminated pastry texts. The result was a marbled effect where veins of sweetness ran through the bread, ensuring more even distribution of these precious ingredients. Tiger nuts, Cyperus esculentus, not actually nuts, but small sweet tubers, feature prominently in elite bread recipes from the New Kingdom period. These were dried, ground into flour, and mixed with wheat to create a distinctively sweet, nutty flavor that didn't require the addition of honey or other sweeteners. The scientific analysis of residue from bread found in Tutankhamun's tomb reveals a substantial tiger nut component, suggesting this flavor was literally fit for kings. Modern attempts to recreate these recipes produce a bread with an almost coconut-like undertone that would likely surprise most people's expectations of ancient fare. Herbs from Egypt's surprisingly diverse pharmacopoeia appeared regularly in specialty breads. Marjoram, mint, and rosemary have all been identified in bread remains from various archaeological sites. Beyond flavor, these additions were often medicinal. Specific herbs were incorporated into breads prescribed for particular ailments. A fascinating medical papyrus from the Ramessid period details recipes for breath-sweetening bread containing mint and cooling bread, featuring cucumber seeds meant to reduce fevers. It's a potent reminder that the line between food and medicine was essentially non-existent in ancient Egypt. Perhaps the most unexpected flavoring discovered in Egyptian bread remains is blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea. This aquatic flower, sacred to Egyptian religion, contained mild psychoactive compounds that induced a gentle sense of euphoria and relaxation. Residue analysis of certain ceremonial breads has detected its presence, suggesting that some ritual loaves were designed not just to feed the body, but to alter consciousness during religious ceremonies. Imagine attending a temple festival and being served bread that not only sustained you physically, but gently shifted your perception toward the divine. Sesame seeds appear with increasing frequency in bread, remains dating from the New Kingdom forward, likely introduced through trade with the Levant. Rather than mixing them into the dough, Egyptian bakers typically pressed them into the loaf surface just before baking, creating a decorative pattern while adding a nutty crunch to the crust. Experimental archaeology suggests they sometimes brushed the loaves with honey water first, helping the seeds adhere while adding a subtle sweetness to the exterior. The most sophisticated flavoring techniques combined multiple additions in careful balance. A particularly well-preserved bread specimen from a New Kingdom tomb contained traces of coriander, cumin, fenugreek, and date fragments, a complex flavor profile that would hold its own in any modern artisanal bakery. What's striking is the careful proportion of these ingredients, suggesting not random addition, but deliberate recipes refined over generations. These weren't haphazard innovations, but carefully developed culinary traditions passed down through specialized baking knowledge, an ancient Egyptian equivalent of sourdough starters that artisanal bakers now treat as family heirlooms. Honey transforms ordinary bread into something transcendent, and ancient Egyptians understood this alchemy better than most. As you dip your finger into a pot of authentic Egyptian honey, thicker and more aromatic than modern varieties, you appreciate why this golden substance was considered literally divine. Egyptian mythology held that honey originated from the tears of the sun, god Ra falling to earth, a poetic explanation for a substance that seemed miraculous in its preservation properties and natural sweetness. The combination of honey and bread created Egypt's most celebrated sweet treats, reserved primarily for special occasions, religious festivals, and offerings to the gods. Unlike today's clear separation between bread and dessert, Egyptian honey-sweetened specialties occupied a fascinating middle ground, still recognizably bread, but transformed into something approaching cake. Archaeological evidence from tomb offerings reveals loaves literally soaked in honey until saturated, creating a preservation method that sometimes proved remarkably effective. Several honey breads recovered from intact tombs remained edible, though perhaps not appetizing by modern standards after thousands of years. A particularly interesting technique documented in tomb paintings shows bakers creating what modern archaeologists call honeycomb bread. This specialized loaf featured a honeycomb pattern of small depressions pressed into the dough before baking. After the bread emerged from the oven, these depressions were filled with warm honey, which slowly permeated the surrounding bread. The result was a treat featuring pockets of intense sweetness surrounded by more subtly flavored bread, an ancient version of honey-dipped donut holes, all contained within a single loaf. Historians still argue about exactly when Egyptians began incorporating honey directly into bread dough rather than applying it after baking. Evidence suggests the practice became common during the Middle Kingdom period, around 2000 BCE, coinciding with more sophisticated beekeeping techniques that increased honey production. Before this innovation, honey's hygroscopic properties, its tendency to absorb moisture from its surroundings, posed technical challenges for bakers, as it could disrupt fermentation and affect dough consistency. Egyptian bakers eventually discovered that honey worked best when added late in the kneading process, after fermentation was well established. One quirky specialized honey bread that appears in ceremonial contexts is the beset loaf, a honey-drenched creation shaped like the dwarf god Bez, protector of households and childbirth. These figurative breads, sometimes reaching impressive heights of artistic detail, were presented at celebrations marking the birth of children in wealthy households. The combination of honey's preservative properties and Bess's protective associations made these loaves particularly significant. Some were kept for years as protective talismans in household shrines, occasionally receiving fresh applications of honey to maintain their preservative magic. The distinct honey varieties available to Egyptian bakers would surprise modern consumers accustomed to generic commercial products. Archaeological evidence and textual references identify at least 4 distinct types of honey in regular use. Light, aromatic honey from clover fields in the Delta region. Darker, more robust honey from hives placed near date palm plantations. A rare prized variety from bees that pollinated Persea trees, considered sacred to the goddess Isis, and wild honey gathered from desert regions, noted for its intense, almost medicinal qualities. Each variety found its way into different specialized breads, creating a sophisticated palette of sweetness profiles. Perhaps the most elaborate honey-sweetened specialties emerged during the New Kingdom period, when Egyptian bakers began incorporating multiple sweetening agents into a single loaf. Analysis of residues from ceremonial breads found in elite tombs from this era reveals the simultaneous presence of honey, date syrup, and tiger nut extract, a triple sweetener approach that created extraordinary richness. These luxury loaves were often further enhanced with expensive imported spices like cinnamon and cardamom, creating flavor combinations that would seem perfectly at home in a modern high-end bakery. For religious festivals, particularly those honoring Hathor, goddess of love, music, and sweetness, bakers developed specialized honey-soaked loaves shaped like musical instruments, especially sistrums, the rattle-like instruments associated with Hathor's worship. These ceremonial breads weren't just visually symbolic. They were designed to be broken apart during rituals, releasing their sweet fragrance as an offering to the goddess. The sensory experience, the honey's aroma mixing with temple incense, was considered as important as the physical offering itself. The technique of honey bread fermentation represents one of ancient Egypt's most fascinating culinary innovations. Certain ceremonial recipes called for dough to be mixed with significant quantities of honey, then allowed to ferment for much longer periods than standard bread, sometimes up to 7 days in cool storage. This extended fermentation allowed specialized yeasts and bacteria to develop, creating complex, slightly tangy flavor profiles, similar to modern sourdough, but with distinctive honey notes. Modern attempts to recreate these recipes suggest they produced a bread with an almost mead-like quality, both sweet and slightly alcoholic. While honey-sweetened breads featured prominently in religious and celebratory contexts, they occasionally appeared in medicinal applications as well. The Ebers Papyrus, Egypt's most comprehensive medical text, includes prescriptions for honey breads intended to treat various ailments, from digestive complaints to eye infections. One particularly interesting recipe calls for a honey-saturated bread poultice applied directly to wounds, a treatment modern research suggests may have been surprisingly effective given honey's documented antimicrobial properties. It's a powerful reminder that for ancient Egyptians, the boundaries between food, medicine, and religious offering were remarkably fluid. The association between honey bread and immortality appears repeatedly in Egyptian funerary texts. The Book of the Dead includes spells ensuring the deceased would enjoy sweet bread of eternity in the afterlife, while tomb paintings often depict offering bearers carrying distinctive honey-soaked loaves toward the deceased. This connection wasn't merely symbolic. Honey's remarkable preservation properties served as a natural metaphor for overcoming death, while its golden color evoked the sun's daily rebirth. When you place honey bread in an Egyptian tomb, you're not just leaving food, you're providing a physical embodiment of the sweet eternal life the deceased hopes to attain. The relationship between bread and beer in ancient Egypt was so intimate that they were essentially twins born from the same process, rather than separate culinary. As you wander through an Egyptian village, the line between bakery and brewery blurs before your eyes. The same workers often handle both products, the same ingredients form their foundations, and sometimes even the same buildings house their production. This brewing bread connection represents one of ancient Egypt's most ingenious culinary innovations, a symbiotic relationship that maximized limited resources while creating the two staples that literally sustained civilization. At the heart of this connection lies a remarkable ingredient known to Egyptologists as beer bread, or in ancient Egyptian, tanejem. Neither fully bread nor beer, this intermediate product served as the essential bridge between the two. To create it, bakers would form emmer dough into small loaves, but deliberately underbake them, leaving the centers doughy and rich in active enzymes. These loaves, with their crust-covered exteriors and soft, moist interiors, became the starter for beer production. When crumbled into water with additional grain, their partially converted starches and active enzymes accelerated fermentation, inoculated the liquid with appropriate microorganisms, and contributed distinctive flavors to the finished beer. Archaeologists excavating the vast brewery-bakery complex at Hierakonpolis, dating to around 3500 BCE, made a fascinating discovery. The facility's layout revealed no clear division between bread and beer production areas. Instead, workers moved seamlessly between both activities, often using the same equipment for different stages of bread and beer making. The excavation revealed specialized ceramic vats with residue showing they had been used alternately for dough fermentation and beer mashing, physical evidence of the blurred boundary between these processes that modern categorizations might miss. A quirky historical detail reveals just how thoroughly bread and beer production intertwined. The same hieroglyph determined both words in ancient Egyptian writing. This house of beer bread glyph depicts a jar inside a house, serving as the classifier for both products, a linguistic acknowledgement that Egyptians conceptualized them as variations of the same fundamental substance rather than entirely separate foods. This cognitive merging of bread and beer appears consistently across thousands of years of Egyptian texts, suggesting it wasn't a mere linguistic coincidence, but a fundamental aspect of how they understood these staples. Perhaps the most ingenious aspect of this connection was the cyclical efficiency it created. Spent grain from beer production, the malted fermented residue left after liquid was strained off, didn't go to waste, but instead became an ingredient in certain bread varieties. These secondary breads incorporated this nutrient-rich brewing byproduct, creating loaves with distinctive sourdough-like tanginess and improved nutritional profiles. Historians still argue about whether these recycled grain breads were considered lower status foods or whether their unique flavors earned them special appreciation. Either way, they represent a remarkably efficient use of resources in a civilization where nothing could be wasted. The technical sophistication of this bread-beer relationship shouldn't be underestimated. Egyptian bread brewers effectively managed complex biochemical processes involving enzyme activation, starch conversion, and microbial fermentation without any knowledge of the underlying chemistry. Through careful observation and generational knowledge transfer, they developed techniques that precisely controlled these natural processes. For instance, they discovered that bread baked at specific temperatures would retain more active amylase enzymes, making it more effective as a brewing starter. This represents a form of empirical science thousands of years before the scientific method was formalized. If you were to taste beer made through this traditional Egyptian process, the bread connection would be immediately apparent. Unlike modern beers, which strive to filter out all solid matter, Egyptian beer contained substantial bread particles in suspension, creating a thick, gruel-like consistency often consumed through straws specifically designed to filter out the larger solids. The flavor profile featured pronounced bready notes alongside the expected fermentation characteristics, creating what one experimental archaeologist described as liquid bread with a kick, an apt description of a beverage that blurred the definitional boundaries between bread and beer. The economic administration of Egypt further reinforces this bread-beer connection. Payment records from various periods show workers receiving rations calculated in standardized units of bread and beer, often in a fixed ratio to each other. The workers building the Giza pyramids, for instance, received daily rations of roughly 10 loaves of bread and 4 jars of beer per day, proportions suggesting these weren't seen as different food categories, but as complementary forms of the same basic sustenance. Some scholars have suggested that these rations were sometimes provided as beer bread itself, allowing workers to decide whether to consume it directly or convert it to beer based on personal preference. Religious texts provide additional evidence of how Egyptians conceptualized the bread-beer relationship. In offering formulas inscribed in tombs across all historical periods, the phrase bread and beer appears with such consistent conjunction that it functions almost as a single compound concept. The offering ritual itself often involved the symbolic transformation of one into the other, solid bread becoming liquid beer, a transformation that mirrored other important Egyptian religious concepts around solidity and fluidity, permanence and change. The bread-beer connection extended beyond production to consumption patterns as well. Evidence from both archaeological remains and artistic depictions suggests that Egyptians typically consumed them together during meals, with pieces of bread often dipped directly into beer. This practice, which might seem strange to modern diners accustomed to thinking of beer as a discrete beverage, made perfect sense given their shared origins and complementary nutritional profiles. Together, they provided carbohydrates, proteins, vitamins, and even probiotics from fermentation, a surprisingly complete nutritional package from what appears at first glance to be a rather limited diet. From the earliest pre-dynastic settlements to the latest Ptolemaic temples, this profound connection between brewing and baking remained a constant in Egyptian civilization, a remarkable example of cultural continuity spanning more than 3,000 years. Even as other aspects of Egyptian society evolved dramatically across millennia, the fundamental relationship between bread and beer production remained largely unchanged, a testament to the elegant efficiency of a system that simultaneously addressed nutritional needs, resource limitations, flavor preferences, and even theological concepts through a single integrated process. When you look at Egyptian bread, you're also looking at Egyptian beer, and vice versa, two expressions of a single culinary concept that sustained one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. The professional bakers of ancient Egypt formed a distinct and surprisingly sophisticated guild, operating under protocols and traditions that would not seem entirely unfamiliar to modern artisanal bakers. As you gain access to a professional bakery attached to a temple or noble household, the first thing that strikes you is the level of specialization. This isn't a single baker handling all aspects of production. It's a carefully orchestrated team of specialists, each responsible for a distinct phase of the bread-making process. At the entrance to most professional bakeries, you'd notice a distinctive wall painting or carved relief depicting the goddess Renenutet, serpent deity of the harvest and nourishment, often shown with stalks of wheat sprouting from her head. Professional bakers considered her their patron and protector, believing she ensured consistent quality and prevented spoilage. Before beginning each day's work, the master baker would typically pour a small grain offering before her image, a ritual that merged religious devotion with practical quality control, as this moment provided an opportunity to visually inspect the day's grain supply for signs of infestation or moisture damage. The hierarchy within the Bakers' Guild was precisely defined. At the top stood the overseer of bakers, Immerse FTW in ancient Egyptian, a position of considerable prestige evidenced by several elaborate tombs belonging to these officials discovered near Memphis and Thebes. Below the overseer worked various specialized bakers, grain cleaners, millers, dough mixers, shapers, and oven masters, each with clearly defined responsibilities and specialized tools. Archaeological evidence from the workmen's village at Deir el-Medina reveals that professional bakers even had their own distinctive hand callus patterns, allowing modern researchers to identify them from skeletal remains, physical evidence of lifelong specialization within the craft. A particularly fascinating aspect of the Bakers' Guild was its system of knowledge transmission. Baking techniques weren't typically written down, but passed through a formal apprenticeship system. Tomb biographies occasionally mention bakers who proudly claimed to have been trained in the house of bread of Pharaoh himself, or similar prestigious credentials. Young apprentices typically began around age 12, spending the first several years performing basic tasks like grain cleaning and fuel preparation before gradually being introduced to more complex techniques. By their mid-20s, particularly talented bakers might achieve full professional status, marked by the ritual presentation of a specialized copper dough scraper, examples of which have been found in tombs. Historians still argue about the gender dynamics within professional bakeries. While household bread production was overwhelmingly performed by women throughout Egyptian history, evidence regarding professional bakeries presents a more complex picture. Temple and palace bakeries appear to have employed primarily male bakers in supervisory roles, but numerous artistic depictions show women forming and shaping dough even in these institutional settings. One intriguing administrative papyrus from the Ramessid period lists bakery workers by name, revealing a mixed-gender workplace, with women often specializing in the delicate work of shaping ceremonial loaves, while men typically handled the physically demanding tasks of milling and oven management. A quirky detail that archaeological evidence has revealed is the existence of specialized dough shoes, wooden footwear used by professional bakers when kneading particularly large batches of dough with their feet. These kneading shoes, featuring ridged soles designed to maximize mixing efficiency, represent a clever ergonomic innovation that protected bakers' feet while improving dough development. Examples discovered at a bakery complex near Abydos show signs of extensive wear, suggesting these specialized tools were highly valued and used for years before replacement. Professional bakeries possessed sophisticated quality control measures that might surprise modern observers. Standardized clay tokens have been discovered at several large-scale bakeries, apparently used to track different batches through the production process, an ancient version of modern production tracking systems. Some tokens bear impressions indicating the grain source, bakery section, or intended recipient of specific batches, allowing administrators to trace problems back to their source when quality issues arose. This level of production management represents remarkable organizational sophistication for the time period. the secretive nature of certain specialized baking techniques contributes to the guild's mystique. Professional bakers developed closely guarded methods for creating particular loaf types, especially those used in religious ceremonies. The exact technique for producing the distinctive conical sheens bread used in temple offerings, for instance, remains somewhat mysterious despite extensive archaeological evidence of the loaves themselves. Experimental attempts to recreate them suggest they required specialized molds and precise control of fermentation temperatures, knowledge that would have given guild members valuable professional capital in Egyptian society. The professional baker's toolkit reflected their specialized status. Unlike household bakers who used mainly multi-purpose implements, professional bakers possessed custom tools crafted specifically for bread production. Copper dough cutters with specialized handles for different grips, cedar kneading troughs designed to maintain ideal dough temperatures, stone rollers for creating specific textures, and precision measuring scoops calibrated to official volume standards have all been discovered in bakery excavations. The significant investment these tools represented, some made from imported materials like Lebanese cedar, underscores the economic importance and social status of the baking profession. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of professional Egyptian bakeries was their production scale. Administrative records from the temple complex at Medinet Habu document a single royal bakery producing over 3,000 loaves daily, an astonishing output achieved without mechanical assistance beyond simple grinding stones and human-powered kneading. The logistics required to coordinate grain procurement, fuel supply, water delivery, workforce management, and distribution of the finished product represented a major administrative achievement. Professional bakers didn't just make bread, they operated complex production facilities that functioned as critical infrastructure within Egyptian society. The Bakers' Guild maintained its essential cultural role across dynastic changes, foreign occupations, and religious transformations, a testament to bread's unshakable centrality in Egyptian civilization. Even during periods of significant cultural upheaval, such as the Hyksos occupation or Persian rule, the fundamental techniques, organizational structure, and social position of professional bakers remained remarkably consistent. When archaeologists uncover bakeries spanning different historical periods, the technological continuity often proves more striking than the differences, suggesting the guild successfully preserved and transmitted its specialized knowledge across generations regardless of political circumstances. For the average Egyptian, encountering bread from a professional bakery would have been a notable experience, like comparing a mass-produced supermarket loaf to an artisanal sourdough today, but with even greater contrast. The difference wasn't just in ingredients or appearance, but in fundamental consistency and reliability. While household bread might vary significantly based on available ingredients, fuel, and individual skill, professional bakeries maintained remarkable standardization, an early example of brand consistency thousands of years before the concept formally existed. When you bit into bread bearing the distinctive stamp of a renowned temple bakery, you weren't just consuming calories. You were participating in a sophisticated culinary tradition maintained by one of history's oldest professional guilds. In ancient Egypt, bread transcended its role as mere sustenance to function as a sophisticated economic instrument, perhaps history's earliest form of standardized currency. As you observe transactions throughout Egyptian society, from grand temple complexes to humble village markets, you notice something surprising. Bread loaves changing hands not just as food, but as standardized units of value in a complex economy that operated centuries before the invention of coined money. The foundation of bread's monetary function lay in its remarkable standardization. By the Old Kingdom period, around 2600 BCE, administrative records show that Egyptian authorities had established precise specifications for various bread types, controlling not just their weight and size, but even their ingredient ratios and baking methods. The most common currency loaf was the tahej, or white bread, a conical loaf weighing approximately 1 deben, 90 grams, produced to exacting standards. Archaeological evidence confirms this standardization. Dozens of these loaves discovered in different sites maintain remarkable consistency in size, weight, and composition, suggesting centralized control of their production specifications. Payment records from royal works projects provide the clearest evidence of bread's monetary function. Workers at the Giza pyramids, for instance, received wages calculated in bread units, typically 10 loaves per day for ordinary laborers, with skilled craftsmen and overseers earning substantially more. However, physical evidence confirms these workers didn't actually consume all this bread themselves. Instead, they often traded surplus loaves back to institutional bakeries in exchange for other goods at fixed conversion rates. This circulation pattern, bread distributed as payment, then partially returned to producers in exchange for other commodities, mirrors the circulation patterns of modern currency with remarkable similarity. Historians still argue about exactly how practical this bread-based economy was for everyday transactions. Bread's limited shelf life in Egypt's hot climate posed obvious challenges for long-term value storage. However, evidence suggests Egyptians developed clever workarounds for this limitation. Special, long-keeping bread with higher salt content and multiple baking cycles created loaves that remained stable for weeks rather than days. Additionally, administrative texts reveal a sophisticated system where bread entitlements could be recorded and transferred as abstract credits without physical loaves changing hands, essentially a bread-backed accounting system that functioned even when actual bread wasn't present. A particularly quirky aspect of bread currency was the development of specialized token loaves that had no practical food value whatsoever. Archaeological excavations at several administrative centers have uncovered small clay loaves, deliberately overbaked to the point of inedibility and sometimes marked with official stamps. Analysis suggests these served as physical receipts representing bread entitlements, an intermediate step between actual bread currency and fully abstract accounting. Imagine carrying what looks like a small, rock-hard bread roll in your pocket as proof of payment or debt, a distant ancestor of paper money. The bread standard economy created fascinating exchange rates between different commodities. Administrative texts from various periods document standardized conversions. One standard beer jar equaled 2 bread loaves, a bundle of onions traded for half a loaf. A simple linen garment cost around 50 loaves. These relative values remained remarkably stable across centuries, suggesting bread functioned as an effective price anchor in the Egyptian economy. Perhaps most interestingly, labor itself was often valued directly in bread terms. A day's work on various projects earned specific bread quantities, creating a direct link between human effort and the fundamental energy source that sustained it. Temple economies offer particularly rich evidence of bread's monetary function. The extensive temple complex at Karnak operated what modern economists might recognize as a sophisticated central banking system based on bread production and distribution. Specialized temple bakeries produced standardized loaves that circulated both as religious offerings and economic tokens throughout the surrounding community. Temple administrative texts record bread-denominated accounts for thousands of individuals connected to the institution, with debits and credits calculated in loaves, but often settled through transfer of other goods at standardized conversion rates. The symbolic power of bread currency extended even to international relations. Egyptian diplomatic correspondence sometimes describes foreign tribute payments in bread equivalent terms, regardless of what commodities actually changed hands. This practice reveals how thoroughly bread had become the conceptual foundation of value in Egyptian economic thinking. Even when dealing with distant cultures using entirely different economic systems, Egyptian administrators mentally converted foreign goods into their bread equivalent to assess their true worth, much as modern travelers might mentally convert foreign currencies to their home currency to understand prices. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of bread's monetary function was its role in complex financial instruments. Several papyri from the New Kingdom period document what appear to be bread-denominated loans with specified interest rates, typically calculated as an extra loaf per 10 per moon, roughly 10% monthly interest. Other texts record bread-denominated rental agreements, labor contracts, and even dowry arrangements. These sophisticated financial applications suggest bread had evolved far beyond physical food to become a fully abstract unit of account, approaching the functions of modern money despite never developing physical characteristics that we typically associate with currency. The tax system provided another crucial context for bread's monetary role. Tax assessments throughout Egyptian history were typically calculated in grain measurements, but administrative records show taxes frequently paid in bread loaves at standardized conversion rates. This standardization simplified accounting enormously. Rather than dealing with varying grain qualities or measuring disputes, tax collectors could count units. For taxpayers who produced goods other than grain or bread, official conversion tables established exactly how many painted pots, linen cloths, or bundles of papyrus equaled the required bread value, creating a remarkably flexible system. This bread-centered economy persisted with remarkable stability until the late period, around 600 BCE, when increased foreign contact, particularly with Greece and Persia, gradually introduced metal coinage to Egypt. Yet even as coins began circulating, bread retained its role as a value standard well into the Ptolemaic period. Administrative records from the 3rd century BCE still calculate wages in bread equivalents, even when actual payment occurred in Greek-style drachma coins. This lingering bread standard accounting, centuries after the introduction of coinage, testifies to the remarkable tenacity of a system that had efficiently structured Egyptian economic life for over 2,000 years. When you look at an ancient Egyptian bread loaf through this economic lens, you're not just seeing food, you're looking at one of humanity's earliest successful currencies, a standardized store of value that helped build pyramids, maintain temples, and structure an entire society's understanding of worth. The humble loaf on an Egyptian table represented not just calories, but a sophisticated economic innovation that solved the fundamental challenges of creating broadly accepted, standardized value in a pre-metal coinage world. The challenge of preserving bread in Egypt's punishing climate forced ancient bakers to develop remarkably innovative techniques that transformed bread from a highly perishable item into something that could last for days, weeks, or in some extraordinary cases, millennia. As you step into the fierce Egyptian sun, where temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees, the 38 degrees, you immediately understand why preservation presented such a formidable challenge, and why the solutions Egyptians developed reveal so much about their technological ingenuity. The most basic preservation technique employed by Egyptian bakers was multiple baking, a process archaeologists have documented through analysis of bread, remains found in tombs and settlements. Unlike modern bread that's baked once at a consistently high temperature, certain Egyptian preservation loaves underwent a complex, multi-stage baking process. The first baking was brief and at relatively low temperature, creating a partially cooked dough in which enzymatic activity had been halted. After cooling, these partially baked loaves underwent a second, longer baking at lower temperature, driving off additional moisture without burning the exterior. For the longest keeping varieties, a third, extremely low temperature baking could extend for up to 12 hours, creating bread with moisture content below 10%, approaching the dryness of modern crackers. The distinctive conical or cylindrical shapes of many Egyptian bread types weren't simply aesthetic choices, but deliberate preservation strategies. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that these shapes maximized surface-to-volume ratio, allowing for more efficient moisture removal during baking. Additionally, the smaller contact area between these loaves when stacked reduced moisture transfer between them during storage. Next time you see those iconic tall pointed loaves in Egyptian tomb paintings, recognize you're looking at practical preservation technology disguised as distinctive cultural style. A quirky preservation method documented in several medical papyri involved the application of natron, the naturally occurring sodium compound Egyptians famously used in mummification. Certain special purpose preservation loaves were lightly dusted with this mineral salt after baking. Beyond inhibiting microbial growth through both antimicrobial properties and moisture reduction, natron imparted a distinctive flavor that some texts suggest was actually preferred for certain types of ceremonial bread. Modern experiments recreating this technique create bread with a uniquely tangy, almost cheese-like undertone, an acquired taste perhaps, but effective for extending shelf life from days to weeks. Historians still argue about the exact purpose of the large-scale bread desiccation facilities discovered at several administrative centers. These specialized rooms featured slatted wooden platforms suspended above heat sources, with evidence suggesting bread was placed on these platforms for extended drying after the initial baking process. Some scholars interpret these as purely preservation facilities, while others propose they may have served multiple purposes, including the production of specialized bread types that required precise drying conditions. Whatever their exact function, these facilities represent surprisingly sophisticated climate-controlled environments created specifically for bread processing. Perhaps the most fascinating preservation technique emerged from the intersection of bread making and brewing. Archaeological evidence from several sites reveals that certain preservation loaves contain significantly higher alcoholic content than standard bread. This was achieved by using unusually high proportions of malted grain in the dough and extending fermentation time before. The resulting alcohol content created a powerful preservation effect, while the addition of honey further inhibited microbial growth. These journey breads, documented in texts describing military campaigns and trading expeditions, could reportedly remain edible for several months, making them perhaps the world's first energy bars designed specifically for travelers. The Egyptian understanding of packaging for bread preservation would impress even modern food scientists. Remains discovered in tombs showed bread wrapped in layers of linen that had been treated with various plant resins, creating a semi-permeable barrier that allowed some continued moisture evaporation while protecting against insects and environmental contaminants. Particularly valuable preservation loaves might receive an additional outer layer of clay, creating an almost hermetically sealed package. An administrative text from the New Kingdom period describes military rations packaged in this manner remaining edible after being transported from the northern waters to the southern desert, a journey of several weeks through extremely challenging climate conditions. Storage containers developed specifically for bread preservation have been discovered in numerous archaeological contexts. These specialized ceramic vessels feature small perforations near their bases and unusual internal ridges. Experimental reconstructions suggest they created surprisingly effective microclimates for bread storage, allowing continued slow moisture release while protecting contents from rodents and insects. The most sophisticated examples from elite households contained internal compartments with different perforation patterns, possibly for storing different bread types under optimal conditions for each. The significant investment these specialized storage solutions represented underscores the importance of bread preservation in Egyptian economic life. The social dimension of bread preservation reveals fascinating insights into Egyptian community structures. Evidence from several workers' villages suggests communal preservation facilities where families could bring their household bread for professional drying and storage. This cooperative approach allowed for more efficient use of fuel and specialized equipment than individual households could manage alone. Administrative texts occasionally mention specialized keepers of the bread, whose sole responsibility was managing these community preservation resources. An early example of public infrastructure designed around a critical food resource. The ultimate preservation achievement, of course, appears in tomb contexts, where bread was expected to last literally forever as spiritual sustenance for the deceased. These eternity loaves underwent the most extreme preservation treatments: multiple bakings, alcohol and honey incorporation, natron application, resin coating, and sometimes even a final firing that essentially carbonized the outer layer, creating a natural seal. The effectiveness of these techniques is demonstrated by the numerous intact loaves archaeologists have recovered from ancient tombs, bread that has maintained its recognizable form for thousands of years, though admittedly no longer at peak culinary quality. Perhaps most impressive about Egyptian bread preservation techniques is how they adapted to different social contexts and needs. The preservation methods applied to a traveler's journey bread differed significantly from those used for a military campaign loaf or a household's weekly baking. This context-specific approach reveals a sophisticated understanding of the preservation challenges posed by different usage scenarios. A wealthy household might maintain several different types of preserved bread simultaneously. Lightly preserved loaves for immediate consumption, moderately preserved varieties for the coming week, and intensively preserved special-purpose loaves for emergencies or specific occasions. A preservation spectrum that mirrors modern households, maintaining fresh bread, frozen bread, and perhaps dried crackers for different needs. When you examine the remarkable preservation achievements of ancient Egyptian bakers, you're witnessing more than clever food science. You're seeing a civilization's determination to assert control over one of humanity's most fundamental challenges: maintaining consistent food access despite environmental challenges and seasonal fluctuations. These preservation techniques didn't just keep bread edible longer, they transformed Egypt's relationship with its staple food, creating stability and predictability that supported everything from military campaigns to religious practices to everyday household management across one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. Egypt's vast geographic expanse, stretching from Mediterranean shores to Nubian borderlands, created distinctive regional bread traditions, as diverse as the landscapes themselves. As you journey from north to south along the Nile, you discover that Egyptian bread was never a single monolithic food, but rather a spectrum of local variations, each adapting to unique environmental conditions, available ingredients, and cultural influences. These regional bread identities remain one of the least explored aspects of Egyptian food history, yet they reveal fascinating insights into how environment shapes culinary tradition. In the lush delta region of Lower Egypt, where multiple Nile branches created exceptionally fertile soil, bread took on characteristics that set it apart from southern varieties. Delta loaves typically incorporated barley alongside emmer wheat at much higher proportions than elsewhere in Egypt. Archaeological evidence from sites like Buto and Tel El Daba reveals bread with up to 40% barley content, a ratio rarely seen in Upper Egyptian sites. This wasn't merely a matter of taste preference. The delta's higher humidity made pure wheat doughs more challenging to work with, while the addition of barley created more manageable consistency. The resulting bread had a distinctive moistness and slightly sweet flavor profile that became the region's signature style. The Fayum oasis, with its unique isolated ecosystem, developed perhaps Egypt's most distinctive regional bread tradition. Excavations at several Fayum settlements have uncovered bread remains containing substantial quantities of clubrush seeds, Schonoplectus, harvested from the oasis lake. This wild plant resource, incorporated into dough at up to 15% concentration, gave Fayum bread a distinctive nutty flavor and unusual blue-gray speckled appearance. A fascinating detail from Herodotus's later account of Egypt specifically mentions the unusual bread of this region, describing it as darkened with seeds from the waters, a rare ancient acknowledgement of regional bread diversity that archaeological evidence now confirms. Upper Egyptian bread traditions from the area around Thebes, modern Luxor, reflected adaptation to the region's more arid conditions. Bread recovered from tombs in this region shows higher salt content and evidence of longer baking times than northern counterparts, adaptations that improved preservation in the intensely dry climate. Upper Egyptian bakers also developed distinctive open-textured loaves with unusually large air pockets, which archaeological experiments suggest helped bread remain palatable longer in the extreme heat, by facilitating continued moisture evaporation during storage rather than trapping it within a dense structure where it could promote mold growth. A particularly quirky regional variation emerges from Egypt's western desert oases, Siwa, Baharia, Farafra, and Dakhla, where isolated communities developed bread traditions incorporating foraged desert plants. Analysis of bread remains from Dakhla Oasis has identified substantial inclusions of desert truffle, terfezia powder, giving local bread distinctive earthy flavors and enhanced protein content. Administrative texts sometimes reference these unusual regional breads being sent as exotic luxury items to the royal court, an ancient equivalent of specialty regional foods marketed to culinary enthusiasts. Historians still argue about precisely when and how clearly defined regional bread identities emerged in ancient Egypt. Some scholars suggest they represent adaptations as old as Egyptian civilization itself, while others propose that more pronounced regional specialization developed during the Middle Kingdom period, when greater political decentralization allowed local culinary practices to flourish. What's not disputed is that by the New Kingdom era, Egyptian texts occasionally reference bread by regional names: Northern White, Southern Dense, Oasis Sweet, suggesting widely recognized distinctions between regional styles. The border regions where Egypt met neighboring cultures developed particularly fascinating hybrid bread traditions. In the northeastern delta, where Egyptian and Canaanite populations intermingled, archaeological evidence reveals distinctive flat bread types incorporating olive oil, an ingredient rarely used in traditional Egyptian baking but common in Levantine traditions. Similarly, in Egypt's southern frontier near Nubia, excavations have uncovered unusual tall cylindrical loaves containing sorghum alongside traditional emmer wheat, reflecting adaptation to ingredients more commonly cultivated in regions south of the First Cataract. The social significance of these regional variations becomes apparent when you examine their presence in elite context. Evidence from several New Kingdom noble tombs shows depictions of offering tables featuring distinctly different bread types, sometimes explicitly labeled with regional designations. This suggests regional breads weren't merely functional adaptations, but recognized culinary specialties that conferred prestige. much like regional wine or cheese traditions in later periods. Administrative texts occasionally mention specific bread types being transported considerable distances for elite consumption, confirming that regional specialties had value beyond their places of origin. Religious practices reveal another fascinating dimension of regional bread variation. Different temple complexes throughout Egypt maintained distinctive bread offerings associated with their particular deities. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera, for instance, produced distinctive loaves incorporating significant quantities of coriander and fenugreek, a spice combination rarely seen elsewhere. Meanwhile, temples to Amun-Ra typically featured bread with more restrained flavoring focused primarily on anise. These differences weren't random, but reflected specific theological associations between certain ingredients and particular deities, creating an entire sacred geography of bread variations across Egypt's religious landscape. The preservation techniques discussed earlier also took on regional characteristics. Delta bakers, contending with higher humidity, developed more elaborate multi-stage drying processes and specialized storage vessels with enhanced ventilation features. In contrast, Upper Egyptian preservation techniques emphasized higher salt content and more intense initial baking. Meanwhile, oasis communities created unique preservation methods involving date syrup coatings that simultaneously preserved bread and added sweetness, a technique particularly well documented at Dakhla Oasis, where archaeologists have recovered several examples of these distinctive preserved loaves. Perhaps the most significant insight from studying regional bread variations comes from what they reveal about Egyptian adaptation to environmental constraints. Rather than imposing a single bread standard across diverse ecological zones, Egyptian culture allowed for substantial regional adaptation while maintaining the core cultural significance of bread itself. This balance between fundamental cultural unity and practical regional adaptation represents a sophisticated approach to food culture that helped sustenance practices remain sustainable across Egypt's remarkably diverse environments, from Mediterranean wetlands to desert oases. The regional bread traditions of ancient Egypt offer a powerful reminder that what appears monolithic in historical overview was often richly diverse in lived experience. When you picture ancient Egyptian bread, you shouldn't imagine a single standardized product, but rather a varied landscape of distinct regional identities, each with its own ingredients, techniques, flavors, and cultural associations. Just as modern Egypt maintains regional food traditions despite national unity, ancient Egyptians simultaneously embraced bread as their universal staple food, while allowing it to express the rich diversity of their remarkable civilization. The history of Egyptian bread, like Egypt itself, was never hermetically sealed from outside influences. As you examine bread loaves across Egypt's 3,000-year history, you can trace the subtle fingerprints of foreign cultures that gradually transformed this most Egyptian of foods. From Levantine baking innovations to Persian flavor profiles to Greek technical adaptations, bread became a culinary palimpsest where successive layers of foreign influence blended with native traditions, sometimes so thoroughly that distinguishing original from imported elements becomes nearly impossible. The earliest significant foreign influence on Egyptian bread appears during the Second Intermediate Period, c. 1650–1550 BCE, when the Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant, controlled northern Egypt. Archaeological evidence from Tel el-Daba, the Hyksos capital in the delta, reveals a distinctive bread type never before seen in Egypt: flatbreads baked on heated stones rather than in traditional Egyptian beja ovens. This Levantine technique produced thinner, more flexible loaves that could be wrapped around other foods, essentially the ancestor of modern pita. After the Egyptians expelled the Hyksos and established the New Kingdom, this foreign bread technique didn't disappear, but was incorporated into Egyptian baking repertoire, where stone-baked flatbreads became particularly associated with military contexts, appreciating their practical advantages during campaigns. Distinctive Nubian influences transformed bread traditions in Upper Egypt, particularly during periods of intensive contact like the reign of Hatshepsut, c. 1479-1458 BCE, when Egyptian-Nubian trade flourished. Botanical analysis of bread remains from Elephantine Island near modern Aswan reveals the incorporation of sorghum flour, a grain cultivated in Nubia, but not traditionally in Egypt proper. When mixed with Egyptian emmer wheat, sorghum created loaves with distinctive reddish tint and slightly sweeter flavor profile. Administrative texts from the period occasionally refer to red bread of the southern lands, suggesting this hybrid style gained recognized status within Egyptian culinary vocabulary rather than remaining foreign. A particularly quirky foreign influence appears in bread remains from the Ramesside period, c. the 1292-1069 BCE, when Egypt's empire stretched into the Levant. Chemical analysis of bread from several elite tombs of this era has detected coriander, cumin, and chickpea flour in combinations strikingly similar to contemporary Canaanite cooking. What makes this particularly interesting is that these foreign-influenced breads appear primarily in military contexts, suggesting that Egyptian soldiers stationed abroad developed taste preferences during foreign deployments, which they then brought home, perhaps history's earliest documented example of military personnel as culinary cross-pollinators. Historians still argue about exactly when and how sesame seeds entered Egyptian bread traditions. While sesame appears occasionally in earlier periods, it becomes dramatically more common during the late period, 664-332 BCE, when Persian influence increased. Archaeological evidence from this era shows a sharp rise in sesame-topped bread, particularly in administrative centers with Persian connections. The technique of pressing seeds into the bread's surface before baking, rather than incorporating them into the dough, appears to be specifically Persian in origin. By the Ptolemaic period, this once foreign addition had become so thoroughly Egyptian that Greek administrative texts describe it as characteristic of native bread. The Ptolemaic period, 332-30 BCE, brought perhaps the most significant foreign transformation to Egyptian bread with the introduction of refined kneading techniques from Greece. Greek bakers employed a distinctive two-stage kneading process that incorporated significantly more air into dough, creating lighter, more evenly textured loaves. Architectural evidence from this period reveals the construction of specialized Greek-style commercial bakeries in Alexandria and other major centers, featuring distinctive circular kneading tables and specialized equipment. Administrative records show these bakeries commanded premium prices for their products, suggesting the Greek-influenced styles were perceived as luxury innovations rather than replacements for traditional Egyptian breads. Free-threshing wheat varieties, Triticum aestivum, ancestors of modern bread wheat, represent perhaps the most consequential foreign introduction to Egyptian baking. While traditional emmer had dominated for millennia, these new varieties arrived first with Persian contact and expanded dramatically under Greek rule. Unlike emmer with its stub and husk, free-threshing wheat separated more easily from its chaff, requiring significantly less processing labor. Archaeological evidence shows these new wheat varieties spreading first among elite contexts, before gradually appearing in ordinary households. By the Roman period, they had substantially displaced traditional emmer in many regions, fundamentally transforming the character of Egyptian bread through a change invisible to casual observation but revolutionary in its economic implications. Cultural exchange wasn't always unidirectional, of course. During periods of Egyptian imperial expansion, particularly the New Kingdom, Egyptian bread techniques influenced neighboring cultures in significant ways. Archaeological evidence from Nubian sites shows the gradual adoption of Egyptian-style conical bread molds and baking techniques, while texts from the Levantine cities under Egyptian control mention specialized bakers trained in the manner of Egypt. This two-way cultural exchange created fascinating hybrid traditions, particularly in border regions where multiple influences converged simultaneously. Religious conservatism provided a fascinating counterpoint to these foreign influences. While everyday bread incorporated numerous innovations over time, bread used in temple offerings often deliberately maintained archaic forms and techniques, rejecting foreign influences even centuries after they had been accepted in secular contexts. Ptolemaic-era temple bakeries still produced traditional emmer-conical loaves using methods essentially unchanged since the Old Kingdom, a deliberate archaism meant to maintain ritual purity. This religious conservatism created a dual-track development where innovative, foreign-influenced bread and deliberately traditional styles coexisted within the same communities, but in different contexts. Perhaps the most significant foreign technical innovation was the Greek kribenos, a domed clay oven that allowed for more controlled baking temperatures than traditional Egyptian designs. Archaeological evidence shows these ovens appearing first in Greek settlements like Naucratis, before gradually spreading throughout the Nile Valley during the Ptolemaic period. The kribenos produced loaves with more even crust development and better moisture retention than traditional Egyptian ovens, qualities particularly advantageous for free-threshing wheat varieties that were simultaneously being introduced. This technological shift, combined with new wheat types and kneading techniques, created bread that would have seemed remarkably different from traditional Egyptian loaves: lighter, more evenly textured, and with more consistent crust development. Despite these numerous foreign influences, what's perhaps most remarkable is how thoroughly Egypt domesticated these innovations, incorporating them into a recognizably Egyptian culinary framework, rather than allowing them to exist as parallel foreign traditions. By the Roman period, bread in Egypt had absorbed numerous technical and ingredient innovations while maintaining distinctive Egyptian identity. This pattern of selective adoption and adaptation, taking what was useful from foreign traditions while maintaining core cultural continuity, characterizes Egyptian civilization more broadly. The bread that sustained Romans stationed in Egypt might incorporate Greek kneading techniques, Persian seed toppings, and free-threshing wheat varieties, yet remained unmistakably Egyptian in its cultural significance and place within society. A perfect culinary embodiment of Egypt's remarkable ability to absorb while maintaining its essential character across millennia. In nearly every artistic depiction of Egyptian bread production, from Old Kingdom tomb paintings to late-period temple reliefs, the hands shaping the dough belong predominantly to women. As you peer more closely at these ancient scenes, patterns emerge that reveal bread as a domain where female knowledge, expertise, and authority operated with remarkable consistency across thousands of years of Egyptian history. This gendered dimension of bread production represents one of the most overlooked aspects of ancient Egyptian food culture, yet it provides fascinating insights into how women's specialized knowledge sustained communities and shaped cultural practices. The household bread production that formed the foundation of daily sustenance throughout Egypt was overwhelmingly women's work. Archaeological evidence from ordinary homes reveals this gender division clearly. Grinding stones and baking equipment typically appear in areas of houses associated with female activities, often alongside other tools used exclusively by women. Skeletal remains tell an even more direct story. Women's bodies frequently show distinctive patterns of wear on knee joints, shoulder sockets, and finger bones consistent with the repetitive motions of grain grinding and dough kneading. These physical markers of lifelong bread labor appear so consistently in female remains that bioarchaeologists can often identify a woman's social class simply by examining these occupational indicators. Elite women's skeletons lack these distinctive wear patterns, reflecting their exemption from bread labor. The extraordinary time commitment required for daily bread production shaped women's lives in profound ways. Ethnoarchaeological studies of traditional bread making using ancient methods suggest that producing enough bread for a family of 5 required approximately 5 hours of daily labor, grinding grain, preparing dough, managing fermentation, and baking. This relentless daily burden largely fell to mothers, daughters, and female relatives working in cooperative groups. The time constraints this imposed on women's other activities represented a significant factor structuring daily life, social interactions, and economic opportunities throughout Egyptian society. A particularly fascinating insight comes from experimental archaeology projects that have reconstructed ancient Egyptian grinding techniques. These studies reveal that effective grain grinding required specific body mechanics and subtle technical knowledge that would have been transmitted directly from mother to daughter through years of observation and practice. The precise rocking motion needed to efficiently operate a saddle quern, the specific angle at which to hold the grinding stone, and the tactile judgment to assess flour fineness all represented specialized knowledge developed and maintained primarily by women across generations. Historians still argue about how completely bread production remained gendered across different social contexts. While household bread was clearly women's domain, evidence regarding institutional bakeries presents a more complex picture. Temple and palace bakeries appear to have employed male bakers in supervisory roles, but numerous artistic depictions show women forming and shaping dough even in these institutional settings. One intriguing administrative papyrus from the Ramessid period lists bakery workers by name, revealing a mixed-gender workplace, with women often specializing in the delicate work of shaping ceremonial loaves, while men typically handled the physically demanding tasks of milling and oven management. A quirky detail that emerges from household archaeology is evidence of women's control over this crucial domain. In several excavated villages, bread-making tools show distinctive personalized marks, small carved symbols or painted decorations, suggesting individual ownership and personal investment in these tools. Given bread's central economic importance, this material evidence of women's authority over bread-making equipment suggests they maintained significant control over this critical aspect of household resources. Some scholars have even suggested that bread-making knowledge gave women practical power that partially offset their formal legal disadvantages in Egyptian society. The transmission of bread knowledge demonstrates remarkable continuity across Egyptian history. Technical innovations in bread making spread primarily through female knowledge networks, rather than written instructions or forms. The specific techniques for achieving ideal dough consistency, managing fermentation in different seasonal conditions, and assessing optimal baking completion were passed directly from experienced women to younger learners through demonstration and practice. This oral transmission created regional bread traditions that could remain distinctive for centuries, maintained through generations of women replicating techniques they had learned through direct observation and supervised practice. Religious dimensions of women's bread knowledge appear in several contexts. Female-specific deities like Renenutet, the harvest goddess, and Nephthys were particularly associated with bread production, and household shrines to these goddesses often appear near bread-making areas in ordinary homes. More intriguing are the household magical practices documented in several excavated villages, where small bread amulets, shaped by women during baking, were used for protection during childbirth, healing rituals, and other domestic ceremonies. These practices suggest bread-making knowledge extended beyond nutrition into domains of practical spirituality that operated primarily within female-controlled household spaces. The economic value of women's bread expertise appears clearly in marriage arrangements and household formation. Several surviving marriage contracts specifically mention bread-making equipment among the items a bride brought to her new household, suggesting this productive capacity was explicitly valued in marriage negotiations. Anthropological parallels from traditional societies suggest that a woman's bread-making skill may have significantly influenced her marriage prospects and social standing within Egyptian communities. The quality of bread produced in the household directly affected family health and well-being, making this female knowledge literally vital to family survival. The cooperative nature of women's bread labor created significant social space for information exchange and community building. Ethnographic studies of traditional bread making in modern Egyptian villages, which maintain many ancient techniques, reveal that women typically worked in groups, mothers, daughters, sisters, and neighbors, gathering to perform the labor-intensive tasks of grain processing and baking together. These cooperative work groups created important social contexts for knowledge sharing beyond bread itself, from childcare advice to conflict resolution to community news. The rhythm of daily bread making thus structured not just nutrition, but social communication networks operating primarily among women. Perhaps the most profound insight into women's baking wisdom comes from examining bread in funerary contexts. The specific bread shapes, ingredients, and baking techniques used for mortuary offerings often diverge significantly from everyday bread. Archaeological evidence suggests this specialized mortuary bread knowledge was primarily maintained and transmitted by older women within families, grandmothers, and elderly female relatives who maintained the specific technical knowledge required for these ritual productions. Their expertise ensured that bread used in critical transition moments like death and burial would properly serve its spiritual function, demonstrating how women's bread knowledge extended beyond physical sustenance to encompass the community's spiritual well-being. This gendered domain of bread knowledge represents something remarkable in ancient history, a sphere of technical expertise, practical authority, and economic significance that remained predominantly female across thousands of years of Egyptian civilization. While pharaohs, priests, and male officials controlled formal written knowledge and public authority, women's bread knowledge operated through parallel transmission systems based on demonstration, observation, and practice. When you bite into recreated ancient Egyptian bread, you're tasting the culmination of countless generations of female expertise, an embodied knowledge tradition that literally sustained one of history's greatest civilizations through its daily bread. The evolution of Egyptian bread across nearly 4,000 years of dynastic history reveals a fascinating tension between remarkable continuity and gradual transformation. As you travel chronologically from pre-dynastic village bakeries to the grand kitchens of Cleopatra's Alexandria, you witness how Egypt's signature food both maintained its essential character and adapted to changing circumstances. This dynastic journey through bread history provides a unique window into how Egyptian civilization balanced tradition and innovation across history's longest-lived continuous culture. Pre-dynastic bread, c. 5500, 3100 BCE, emerges from archaeological sites like Hierakonpolis and Ma'adi in recognizably Egyptian form, yet with distinctive early characteristics. These earliest loaves were typically flat and round, baked directly on hearthstones rather than in specialized ovens. Botanical analysis reveals they contained not just emmer wheat, but significant proportions of wild grasses and sedges, evidence of a society still transitioning from foraging to agriculture. Most strikingly, pre-dynastic bread shows minimal evidence of leavening. Most loaves appear to have been unleavened or minimally fermented. The grinding technology used for grain processing was similarly rudimentary, producing exceptionally coarse flour that created dense, gritty bread texture. Yet despite these primitive characteristics, the cultural centrality of bread was already firmly established, with bread deposits appearing in the earliest ritual and burial contexts. The Old Kingdom period, c. 2686 to 181 BCE, witnessed bread's dramatic transformation from simple sustenance to complex cultural institution. The standardization of bread types during this era reflects the broader centralization of Egyptian society. Archaeological evidence from sites like Giza reveals the emergence of specialized bakeries with industrial-scale production capacity, featuring multiple distinct areas for different production stages. Bread types proliferated during this period, with administrative texts from royal complexes documenting over 30 different named varieties. The conical bread shape so characteristic of Egyptian iconography first becomes dominant during this era, likely related to the development of specialized bread molds used in institutional baking. Leavening techniques became more sophisticated, with evidence of consistent sourdough cultures maintained in royal and temple bakeries, though household bread likely still used more opportunistic fermentation methods. A particularly quirky development during the First Intermediate period, c. 2181-2055 BCE, reveals how bread adapted to political fragmentation. With central authority collapsed, regional bread styles became more pronounced, with distinctive local variations emerging in different provinces. Archaeological evidence from this era shows greater variation in grain types, with some regions incorporating higher proportions of barley, or even sorghum, when wheat supplies became unreliable during this troubled period. Bread shapes became less standardized, with local styles proliferating in the absence of centralized control. Historians still argue about whether this regionalization represented a breakdown of cultural standards or a creative adaptation to challenging circumstances, or perhaps both simultaneously. The Middle Kingdom, c. 2055 from 1650 BCE, brought renewed standardization to bread production alongside significant technical innovations. The most noteworthy development was the widespread adoption of the improved Beja oven, featuring more sophisticated airflow management that allowed for better temperature control during. This technical improvement coincided with refinements in fermentation technique that produced lighter, airier loaves than earlier periods. Administrative texts from this era reveal increasingly precise specifications for different bread types, with exact ingredients and proportions carefully documented for institutional bakeries. Archaeological evidence suggests these more standardized techniques gradually spread from institutional contexts to influence household baking practices as well, creating greater consistency between elite and common bread than in earlier periods. Historians still debate the extent of Hyksos' influence on Egyptian bread during the Second Intermediate period, c. 1650-1550 BCE. Archaeological evidence from Tel el-Daba shows the appearance of distinctive Levantine flatbreads alongside traditional Egyptian types, suggesting cultural hybridity rather than replacement. The Hyksos apparently introduced improved grinding technology, using larger, more efficient quernstones that produced finer flour. However, religious conservatism ensured traditional Egyptian bread types remained dominant in ritual contexts even during this period of foreign rule. a pattern of cultural resistance through food traditions that would repeat in later periods of foreign domination. The imperial expansions of the New Kingdom, c. 1550–1069 BCE, brought unprecedented foreign influences into Egyptian bread traditions, as discussed earlier. Yet this period simultaneously saw intensified emphasis on traditional Egyptian bread forms in religious contexts, creating a fascinating culinary dualism. Temple bakeries maintained archaic production methods for ritual loaves, while palace bakeries incorporated foreign innovations for elite. Archaeological evidence from non-elite contexts suggests ordinary households gradually adopted some foreign elements, particularly Near Eastern spice combinations, while maintaining fundamentally Egyptian bread techniques. This selective incorporation of foreign elements while maintaining core traditions characterizes Egyptian cultural responses to imperial interchange throughout the Third Intermediate and Late periods, c. 1069–332 BCE, saw Egyptian bread traditions increasingly influenced by economic pressures and political realities. As wheat became more commercialized, with significant quantities exported to foreign markets, many ordinary households increased their use of barley and other grains in everyday bread. Archaeological evidence shows growing disparity between elite bread, which maintained traditional wheat-dominant recipes, and common bread incorporating more alternative ingredients. Interestingly, despite increasing foreign rule during this period, Egyptian bread maintained its distinctive character, perhaps becoming an important marker of cultural identity in the face of Persian and other foreign administrations. The Ptolemaic Revolution in Egyptian bread, 332–30 BCE, represents perhaps the most significant transformation in its long history. The Greek rulers introduced not just new ingredients, but fundamentally different production technologies. Archaeological evidence shows the rapid spread of Greek kribanos ovens, which allowed for humidity control during baking, creating bread with very different crust and crumb characteristics. More significantly, Greek bakers introduced free-threshing wheat varieties and refined kneading techniques that created lighter, more evenly textured loaves. Administrative records reveal specialized Greek-style bakeries commanding premium prices for these new-style breads, particularly in Alexandria and other urban centers. Yet traditional Egyptian bread persisted alongside these innovations, especially in rural areas and religious contexts, again demonstrating the Egyptian capacity to incorporate foreign elements without surrendering cultural distinctiveness. Roman-era Egyptian bread, 30 BCE, 395 CE, represents the culmination of this long developmental arc, combining elements from multiple earlier traditions into distinctive regional syntheses. Archaeological evidence from cities like Oxyrhynchus reveals remarkable diversity: Egyptian-style emmer loaves, Greek-influenced wheat breads, and Roman military-style hardtack, all produced within the same communities, but for different consumers and contexts. The Roman military presence created demand for specific bread types, particularly the hardtack known as buccellatum, which appeared alongside traditional Egyptian varieties in bakeries throughout the country. More intriguingly, documentary evidence suggests some bakers developed deliberate fusion styles that combine techniques from multiple traditions: Egyptian-shaped loaves produced with Greek techniques, or Roman-style breads incorporating traditional Egyptian flavorings. When we survey this remarkable chronological panorama spanning nearly 4 millennia, what stands out is not just change or continuity in isolation, but their fascinating interplay throughout Egyptian history. Bread maintained its central cultural position, basic ingredient foundations, and ritual significance across dramatic political transformations, from unified kingdom to foreign occupation to imperial power and back again. Yet within this continuity, Egyptian bakers constantly adapted their techniques, incorporated useful innovations, and responded to changing environmental and economic circumstances while maintaining bread's essential Egyptian character. This balance between tradition and adaptation in Egypt's bread culture offers a microcosm of Egyptian civilization itself, a society that maintained remarkable cultural continuity, not through rigid resistance to change, but through selective incorporation of useful innovations within a stable cultural framework. The bread that sustained Cleopatra's court, while technically superior to that eaten by the pyramid builders 2,000 years earlier, remained recognizably part of the same culinary tradition, a testament to Egyptian civilization's remarkable capacity to evolve without surrendering its essential character across history's longest continuous cultural tradition. As the final grains of sand slip through the hourglass of our journey through ancient Egyptian bread, you feel your eyelids growing heavier with each passing moment. The weight of all this historical knowledge settles comfortably around you like a warm blanket. The rhythmic sounds of grinding stones and kneading hands that have accompanied our story begin to fade gently into the background of your consciousness. You can almost smell the earthy aroma of freshly baked emmer loaves cooling in the evening air along the Nile, their crusts crackling softly as they settle. The ancient bakers have completed their day's work. The ovens cool gradually, and the village grows quiet as night falls over the timeless landscape. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you'll find yourself walking through a sunlit Egyptian bakery, the warm grains of sand between your toes, the distant pyramids shimmering on the horizon. The women grinding grain might smile and nod as you pass, acknowledging your newfound appreciation for their ancient craft. The master baker might even offer you a still warm loaf, rough and hearty against your palm. As you drift towards sleep, remember that something as simple as bread connected countless generations across thousands of years, from humble farmers to mighty pharaohs, from priestesses to palace bakers. This most basic of foods carried within it the entire story of one of history's greatest civilizations, its religious beliefs, its social structures, its technological innovations, and its remarkable continuity across millennia. Sleep now, knowing that the ancient Egyptians found not just sustenance, but meaning in their daily bread. And as your consciousness fades into slumber, perhaps you'll appreciate anew the significance of our own daily bread, the foods that sustain us not just physically, but culturally, connecting us to those who came before and those who will follow after our own brief passage through time. Sweet dreams. And may your journey through ancient Egypt's bread traditions bring you not just historical knowledge, but a deeper connection to humanity's enduring relationship with its most essential food.